And here we go. Yes, takeoff of the Boeing 777X.
Woo!
Wow, listen to those engines. Big congratulations to Boeing for finally flying the 777X. That's the sound of those new General Electric engines going overhead as the thing took flight for the very first time after it was postponed 2 separate times due to bad weather. We all know that Boeing just kind of needed to win one, and I'm glad to see that they did. So as Boeing enters a new era with new management, new a lot of things, congratulations to them. And I hope that this is the beginning of a new era of success for them. This is Podcasting on a Plane, episode number 68.
Ground, Skyhawk, off at Alpha 5, taxi to ATP.
Ground taxi to ATP. Hey, Alpha.
ATP Alpha, thanks, man.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. We're excited for the next episode.
Tomorrow.
Welcome back to this Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez, and this is your aviation audio magazine. We hit aviation here from as many angles as possible, and my favorite 2 angles are from the cockpit and from the tower here at West Coast Delta, and that's because I'm an air traffic tower controller. But I'm also a CFI and a pilot and a former a lot of things. You know the story. But now I specialize in high-performance mentoring in the complex world of our national airspace system, or to put it in simple English, I'm the one you call if you're a GA pilot and you want to level up your game in your plane, and particularly on the radios. On this podcast, we share stories, news, and experiences that'll help you love aviation even more. And today's going to be fun, because a lot of it is about you. Plus, I've been getting a lot of positive feedback about the Boeing stuff, so today, part 4 of continuing coverage of what's up with the MAX and with Boeing. But I've got a fair amount of feedback that's been lying around too, just waiting for a good time, and I think it's high time we get to it. So first, it's just you and me and the community. Your questions, your feedback, and some acknowledgement to quite a few new show supporters too. A variety show to say the least, right? But then, if it ain't Boeing, part 4. Are we going yet? Don't go away. Right before I went to record this episode, I went to my first IMC Club meeting. Have you all heard of this? It's a new local chapter that's started by my friend Joe Godfrey, and I guess that makes me an inaugural member. But it was really, really fun. It was a really open and candid bunch of discussion about what the person in the provided scenario would have done. It's an EAA thing, sort of a subset of EAA, and we'll probably cover more on that later. But for now, I just want to give a big shout out to patron Joe Godfrey for getting it all going. Well done, sir. And for more information on IMC, check out EAA.org. Now, I want to start our feedback and our thank yous by mentioning something that I didn't really know was an issue, but maybe it's been affecting you, so I guess the important part is it's fixed now. But new show patron Mike Smith wrote me and he said, "Hi, Brandon, I've been listening to the podcast from the beginning, and I look forward to every episode. Thanks so much for the time and the effort that you obviously put into it. I get the podcast through a podcatcher, which saves the MP3 files, and then I upload those to my MP3 player to play back, so I don't listen directly off the website or from a podcasting app. So when I do download the files, they come through with gobbledygook names like, well, I won't read it to you, but it's computer code to say the least. Can this be changed so that they download with something like episode number 64 MP3 or something recognizable like that? Also, I can't find a way to directly download the MP3 of each episode from the website. For other podcasts, I can usually right-click or something and download the MP3 file, but I can't find a way to do that from your site. He says the reason this would be handy is that I can send a direct link to someone for a specific episode, like the 5 Blackbird episodes, for instance, rather than telling someone to go to the website and look for a specific episode. And then even if I direct someone there, currently it seems like they'd have to listen to the episode straight from the embedded player. Not everyone uses or knows how to use a podcasting app. I absolutely love the 5 Blackbird episodes, so I want to share them. Blue Skies, Mike Smith from Maynard, Massachusetts. Well, looks like I made some incorrect assumptions about listening preferences, didn't I? So I went back and I checked the box for everything since episode number 59. I will continue to do so in the future, and I'll probably go back and do a few more. So you should all be able to directly download the files of this podcast from now on. So if that sounds like you, You can join me in giving Mike a big thanks for pointing out the issue, and I hope that makes things easier. Mike also pledged a generous $50 using PayPal, so Mike, thank you so much for both your financial support as well as your technical support. And I want to acknowledge another individual, a new recurring patron via Patreon named Eric Hazen, and along with his pledge, he writes, "Hey Brandon, Echo Hotel from Boston here. I'm an instrument-rated since '93 commercial pilot, and I fly my Archer everywhere when I can get away from my day job. In June, I flew coast to coast and toured the LA Basin, IFR, in the June gloom. It was quite an adventure, and I was glad to have a co-pilot buddy as we navigated the tech routes. All the controllers were outstanding, and maybe we talked to you. I feel, though, as if I'm a long-time listener due to all your quote-unquote guest appearances on opposing bases with AG and RH. I finally got around to subscribing to and becoming a patron of your podcast. It's great. I just listened to episode 66 with RH, and it was packed with great tips for new, or in fact any pilots, for dealing with ATC and flying near airports in general. This episode should be required listening for all student pilots. And then I binged on the 3 Boeing episodes, and I feel greatly informed and profoundly saddened too. The fall of one of the great last U.S. companies is truly distressing. Anyway, keep up the great work, and now I have to work up on catching up with your back episodes. Best, Echo Hotel." Well, EH, welcome. I'm really glad to have you on board. I don't think we talked since you're a little bit further north of me and up in LA. I'm down in San Diego, but hopefully you can come out again and we can talk that way too. Grant McHarren, he joined as a patron at the $1 level, and I sent him a note thanking him for his support, and then he sent me back this. He said, "Thanks, Brandon. I loved your work with the SR-71 crew members. Also, that last article you read about the MAX really nailed it. Boeing's been going downhill since McDonnell Douglas bought their way into running the company using Boeing's money. The pride and the arrogance has gone through the roof. With the 787, the Tanker, and the MAX are all showing the signs. I really hope this is a major wake-up call, but even with Muhlenberg's departure, I suspect it'll take more. His payout figure indicates it's still not good in there. Anyway, please keep up the great work." Thank you, Grant, and welcome. And lastly, but certainly not least, on Patreon, Ken Hayes. He's been a supporter for a while now, but he upped his per-episode contribution to $3 per episode. Thank you, Ken. And I'll tell you what, I'm feeling particularly buzzed lately because on Buy Me a Coffee, Colm Donilon bought me 3 coffees all the way from Ireland. He's from Westmeath County, which I looked up is right smack dab in the middle of the island. Anyway, thank you, Colm. That's awesome. Brooks Doro bought me 5 coffees, and he said, "Great podcasts. I'm out of Ramona, and I recently completed my IFR, so I may have interacted with you on the radio while in your areas. Keep up the great work." Well, it sounds like we probably have talked before for sure, but next time I hope you say hi, because VHF shoutouts are my favorite. And for all of you who fly by my airport, and if you figured out where West Coast Delta is, I love a VHF shoutout, and I'll probably put it at the beginning of a future episode just like on this one. Listener Brett Ross bought me 3 coffees, and he said, "I like your podcast. Keep up the good work. I really like Spy Week and Concord Week." Well, thank you all. And whenever I can, I want to mention the show's biggest and longest supporting members. Paula and Vince, Brian Juarez, the photo mission pilot, check him out on Instagram. Jeff Riolo from Empower UAV, Captain Jeff, the one and only airline pilot guy himself, Joe Godfrey, who, as I mentioned, recently started an IMC Club chapter locally, so props are in order there for sure. Jamie Bloon, well, you know her story for sure by now. Mohara Mane of the Plain English ATC Communications app, and Tom Qualwasser, who I finally met and shared an espresso with a while back. And if you get value from the show and you want to become a supporter, I'd really appreciate it. And you can get started by going to podcastingonaplane.com and just clicking on support. And if you're not into the financial support thing, hey, I totally understand. Flying's expensive. But you know what's free? I'd really appreciate it if you just leave a 5-star rating and a review on whatever podcasting platform you listen on. And I might even read it on the show, like this one from someone called New Morning. They say, "One of my top 3 aviation podcasts, wide-ranging topics, but always thoughtful and objective." Then we gave 4 stars, which felt a little funny given the top 3 ranking, but hey, whatever, I'll take it. So, however you choose to interact, I appreciate you, and thank you. Which reminds me, it's time to hear from you now. I got a little bit of formal feedback to share, and to transition us into it, I'm going to do something a little different, and that's because I ended up giving some feedback to another aviation podcast. Well, I mean, that part's not weird. I do that all the time. But after a bit of a personal hiatus, Dispatcher Mike from the Flying in Life podcast, who's been an amazing guest on this show before, has made a big comeback along with co-host Dispatcher Greg. Him and I really have a lot in common. We both have a lot on our plates, and I know how hard it can be to put out decent content, so it's really nice to see him back into the mix. If you're not familiar with Flying in Life, go check it out. He's a dispatcher at the very same Acme Airlines as Captain Jeff and Dana from APG, and his show is incredibly genuine. So when I saw him make a comeback, it really struck a chord with me, which is why I sent him this. So I just got in my car and noticed that there is a new episode of the Flying in Life podcast out. And I didn't even want to go back to the studio and record this for you because I'm so excited to see you back that I'm sitting in the parking lot in front of Trader Joe's by my house recording this into my phone. But hey, man, welcome back. I'm glad to see you back in the back in front of a microphone again. You know, I don't think a lot of people realize how tough it is to put out decent content, when you also have a family and full-time job where you work shift work and all that fun stuff we talked about on the last episode that we did together. But anytime you put out an episode, I know we all appreciate it. And I know you've been up to a lot of great stuff. Congrats on running that marathon and achieving your goals there and everything else that you've been up to. But I don't know. I'm just glad to see you back in the podcasting game. And I think I probably speak for everyone when I say we missed you. And glad to see you guys back. So congrats on everything and welcome. It's been a long time, man. Good day. Not bad for an iPhone recording in the Trader Joe's parking lot in my car, huh? So if you want to send feedback to this or any other show, I recommend that's how you do it. You can record something right into your voice memos and then hit send, right to me or to whoever, and then we can put it on the show just like that. Ron Klutz sent me a couple of emails, and I think you all get something out of each one, so here, check these out. Let me read them. The first one's in response to episode number 66, the same one I mentioned a minute ago with RH from Opposing Bases. At the end, I asked my CFIs out there what they teach. Ron wrote in and he said, "Brandon, you asked how we teach our students about radio work. I fly out of Palo Alto with a tower, and we only have 3 non-towered airports within 35 miles, so we get lots of practice talking to ATC. I start off handling the radios myself, and I'll teach them the 4 things to say on a cold call to ATC. I phrase it like you're ordering a pizza. Good evening, Domino's. It's Ron. I live at XXX, and I want a medium combination." I like that. Or, as you know, it's who you're talking to, so they know you got it right, who am I, where I am, and what I want to do. Where they get into trouble is on the readback. I had one student that would reinvent the sequence on every call. I constantly reminded him that the easy way is to just repeat the instructions given, the runway number and the call sign. Say it the same way each time and it gets easier, and you don't have to think about it as much. But the real issue is them being able to recognize our tail number and then know the instruction was for us. As they're able to handle the basic act of flying, then their brain can now handle more tasks and they can slowly hear more on the radio and respond faster and more appropriately. We have great ground controllers and we can ask for a code to XYZ and then get a handoff to departure even though we're just a class Delta. But I also get us out of the area on a cross country sometimes and then have them do the cold call to NorCal so they can learn both ways. We talk about it before flying and then I review with them the process and the handoff sequence and what needs to be said and what can be left out since we're in radar contact. I never got any of this in my private training and I want them to be confident users of the NAS. And then we also go to non-towered airports and go over the radio calls that we make in the blind so that they can learn them firsthand. Thanks for doing what you do, and I love it when you and RH do a show together. I got to meet him and AG out in Oshkosh, and they're a riot. They're great guys. Well, absolutely, Ron. Couldn't agree more. And thank you for doing what you do. It's so important that good CFIs out there teach the right stuff. And I know it's hard, just like we talked about on that show, is that you're having somebody who's not actually a seasoned air traffic controller teach air traffic communications. But it's been my experience that most CFIs are very, very good on the radios. And the ones who do what you do, Ron, where you give them the practice both doing it on the ground, doing it as a cold call further down the line, practicing at non-towered airports, or whatever, those are the students who are going to be the best users of the NAS. Operating in the NAS, or the National Airspace System as we call it, is something that weirdly falls by the wayside when it comes to flight training. Sure, we may operate from a towered airport during initial training, but then dealing with a big TRACON or a center may not come in until the cross-country phase of training, which is usually, of course, towards the end, right? And even then, like we talked about in the episode, you might just do a handful of cross countries before your check ride. At that point, we've often forgotten what the whole point of airplanes is, though, which is to go places besides your home airport, right? Point A to point B. So I'm glad to hear that you're giving them good advice, rehearsing it prior, and then practicing non-standard scenarios so that when things don't go exactly according to our plan, well, that's fine. They don't get flustered or generally weirded out about it. They just pick up the VFR services further down the line. Because let's face it, that's really what makes a great pilot, right? Being able to constantly adapt and cope with things that are non-standard and unexpected, whether it's ATC communications or something far more serious like a major system malfunction. Because once the basics are there, just about anyone could do a routine A to B flight, but it's when things get weird that the true professionals shine. Or better yet, to quote Hunter S. Thompson, when the going gets weird, the weird turn professional. Welcome to aviation. And then Ron actually sent me another email. This one's great too because he says, "Brandon, I just listened to an excellent podcast called Flight Safety Detectives on the 2 737 MAX crashes. One of the hosts is Greg Fife. He worked for the NTSB for many years and he's appeared on many shows explaining the various accidents and he's an expert worth listening to. They report on an amazing sequence of events leading to the 2 crashes and why I think it wouldn't happen with a U.S. carrier due to better training and maintenance. It's the couple of podcasts that they put out this month that cover it. Thanks for the great show as always." Well, you know what? I went out and I had a listen, and I'll tell you what, the Flight Safety Detectives is my recommendation of the week for sure now. These guys are not only well-known NTSB investigators, but they're true insiders. Here, let's have a quick listen.
I'm John Golia.
And I'm Greg Fife.
And we are the Flight Safety Detectives. We're just two guys who have spent most of their career with the National Transportation Safety Board investigating aircraft disasters and aviation safety issues all over the world.
Yep, and this podcast is where we talk about everything from accidents, airplane technology, to the big business of aviation.
We live and breathe aviation. My co-host John has been in the aviation business for more than 60 years. He was the first and only airframe and power plant mechanic to get a presidential appointment to the National Transportation Safety Board.
And Greg is a former air safety investigator and GO team captain for the NTSB. He's investigated everything that flies worldwide since he started his career 40 years ago. And on top of that, he is a Living Legends of Aviation inductee.
So between John and myself, we have over 100 years of aviation safety experience. It's time to buckle up because it's going to be wheels up. Let's get this show in the air.
Amazing stuff. I recommend you go subscribe. And now, If It Ain't Boeing, Part 4. As of literally minutes before I went to record this, I'd spent the morning watching the live stream of the first flight of the 777X, or at least it was supposed to be the first flight at least, because they had to cancel it twice due to inclement weather. It's a huge bummer, 100% not Boeing's fault, but I was really glad to see them finally win one, like I said at the beginning. Unfortunately, it didn't happen on Thursday or Friday, but Saturday was finally the right time. If nothing else, I think that waiting the way that they did shows that the company isn't so much into the F it, let's go make some money approach anymore, and taking the high road of not taking unnecessary risks. And because they waited for the right time, the 777X had a wonderful and productive, and most importantly, safe first flight. And just shortly after that, show patron, listener, and friend Daniel Sternberg sent me this email. He says, "Hey Brandon, Happy New Year. We just happened to be going through Seattle today to have lunch with friends there. And while we were at lunch, guess who finished their first flight at Boeing Field? I'm quite amazed they brought it in there with the bottoms just about 200 feet above minimums. There's rain in our windows, so only one of the shots taken from the taxiway came out okay, but I thought you might enjoy it." And he sent me some pictures of the 777X taxiing in. But just by pure happenstance, they happened to be there in their own aircraft visiting some friends. So pretty neat that someone from this show actually got to see the flight come to a successful completion. Thank you so much, Daniel, for sending that in. And even though it was raining, and I don't think anybody saw a rainbow, it probably feels like rainbows in Seattle today. But maybe not so much in Chicago. Friend of the show, Rob Mark, who's also from Chicago, recently wrote a short article for Flying Magazine. It's called "Boeing's Calhoun Faces a Host of Issues. Skeptics wonder if Calhoun is the best person to fix what ails the aerospace giant." David Calhoun assumed the role of Boeing CEO only 1 week ago, but his plate of problems is already full because of the chaos surrounding the company's beleaguered 737 MAX. Recent news following the ousting of Calhoun's predecessor, Dennis Muhlenberg, has only continued to darken the credibility cloud hanging over the company. Some industry sources are skeptical, however, that David Calhoun, a longtime Boeing board member, is the best person to pull the company out of the hole it dug itself into. Boeing's reportedly planning to begin test flights of the revised MCAS software possibly by March, a year since the fleet was grounded around the world. The MCAS software is believed to be at the heart of both the 2018 Lion Air and 2019 Ethiopian Airlines accidents. An internal Boeing audit in December also discovered potential flaws in 2 critical wiring bundles in the tail section of the MAX, according to the New York Times. They say Boeing is still trying to determine whether that scenario could actually occur on a flight, and if so, whether it would need to separate the wire bundles in the roughly 800 MAX jets that have already been built. Boeing said that a fix for the problem would be relatively simple. The prime economic reason some airlines purchased the 737 MAX centered around Boeing's claim that the updated aircraft would not demand simulator training for thousands of pilots. The company, in fact, promised Southwest Airlines $1 million per airplane if it didn't keep that promise. In March 2017, an email from Boeing's 737 chief technical pilot discussing the transition from older NG models to the MAX was published in the Washington Post last week, and it said, quote, "I want to stress the importance of holding firm that there will not be any type of simulator training required to transition from the NG to MAX. Boeing will not allow that to happen. We'll go face-to-face with any regular who tries to make that requirement," end quote. Last week, Boeing suddenly reversed course, saying it now believes pilots should spend time in a simulator before the airplane returns to service. The final decision rests with the FAA. The New York Times reported that the agency is expected to follow the manufacturer's recommendation. Last Thursday, the Washington Post reported the contents of additional emails and chat messages made public by Boeing last Thursday that offered insights into contemptuous attitudes expressed by a number of unnamed company employees for the creation of the MAX. A Boeing spokesperson said, quote, "These communications do not reflect the company we are and need to be, and they're completely unacceptable." The comments highlight some of the cultural issues now facing Calhoun. Boeing's reportedly tracking down the authors of all the messages released last week. In one message from a Boeing employee posted in April 2017, more than a year before the first accident, this person said of the MAX project, quote, "This airplane is designed by clowns who in turn are supervised by monkeys," end quote. In February 2018, another Boeing employee said, quote, "I don't know how to refer to the very, very few of us on the program who are interested in only the truth, but it's mostly depressing that it's so few," end quote. Another responded, quote, "Honesty is the only way in this job. Integrity, when lives are on the line, and aircraft and training programs shouldn't be taken with a pinch of salt. Would you put your family on a MAX simulator-trained aircraft? I wouldn't," end quote. The first employee agreed, saying, quote, "No." Politico reported Monday that last week's internal Boeing messages has angered many in Congress who are now calling for changes to aviation safety laws. Senate Commerce Committee Chairman Roger Wicker said the messages show a troubling disregard for safety among some at Boeing and raised questions about the efficacy of the FAA's oversight of the certification process. Maria Cantwell wants to organize additional hearings on aviation safety, while Garrett Graves, a member of the House Transportation Committee, says there needs to be either legislative or an administrative fix to the Boeing problems. There are, of course, non-737 MAX issues hounding Calhoun, such as the slowdown of the 777X project and some structural issues related to the 737 NG series. Again, that article by Rob Mark and Flying. And over at Aerotime, it looks like they're thinking the same thing. This article from January 18th, 2020, they say, Boeing CEO timeline. Will Calhoun bring change? When the 737 MAX was grounded by aviation authorities in March 2019, no one expected it to last as much as it has. The latest MAX operator schedule changes indicate that the 737 MAX could stay put for at least a few more months, and Boeing will see its famous narrow-body, once called a game changer, grounded for more than a year since the second fatal crash in Ethiopia in March 2019. Since then, significant changes have been made by Boeing, from establishing a permanent aerospace safety committee inside the company to splitting the roles of president and chief executive officer to ousting the CEO present at the company since 2015, Dennis Muhlenberg. The company's board said goodbye to Muhlenberg just before Christmas on December 23, 2019. Chief Financial Officer Greg Smith served as the interim CEO before David Calhoun, the new long-term CEO, took the company's top executive chair on January 13th. Calhoun's top priority is, of course, to get the 737 MAX back up in the air. The Chicago-based manufacturer's orders and deliveries in 2019 dwindled to record lows due to the MAX crisis. The narrow-body market for both Boeing and Airbus is a cash cow. The European manufacturer delivered 863 aircraft during 2019. Out of those, 642 were its A320 family members. In 2018, Boeing delivered 806 aircraft, 580 of which were the 737s, destined to airlines worldwide. Nevertheless, the 737 MAX crisis not only deepened because of the constantly overly optimistic promises by its former chief executive, but daunting reports revealed some underlying issues within the company. Its safety culture, or lack thereof. With a change at the helm of the company, the change within Boeing is questionable. Out of the 14 current board members, only 6 were not present on the board when the decision was made to launch the 737 MAX. Again, that article from aerotime.aero. In If It Ain't Boeing, Part 3, we finished with one of my favorite articles of 2019 from The Atlantic about how Boeing's culture lost its way, and that's why I like this article from Bloomberg so much. It's short, but it makes a similar point, but with a different tone. It's called How Boeing Lost Its Way, and it's by Joe Nocera. The 2019 column I wish I could most take back was about Boeing. In May, 2 months after the second deadly 737 MAX crash, I compared Boeing's current troubles to other times when Boeing had stumbled badly, including in 2013, when the new 787, which had come to market 4 years behind schedule, had a problem with its lithium-ion batteries, which burst into flame several times. The FAA even grounded the plane temporarily. Airplanes are fiendishly complex, and new planes almost always have kinks that need to be worked out, though admittedly, those kinks don't usually include fatalities. In any case, my working assumption was that the company had always overcome its problems and would do it again. Quote, Boeing's history strongly suggests that it will recover from this fiasco and do so quickly, end quote, I wrote. It will emerge stronger than ever. Ouch. Within a matter of months, I could see that I was wrong and that Boeing was not the same company I had followed 2 decades earlier. In October, Chief Executive Officer Dennis Muhlenberg testified before Congress. He was awful. He kept saying that safety was part of Boeing's DNA, yet the evidence angry legislators confronted him with, internal emails for the most part, suggested just the opposite. The safety was no longer high on Boeing's list of priorities. What was ascendant was maximizing shareholder value, with catastrophic consequences. The company cut corners to get the plane on the market quickly. They used the least expensive suppliers regardless of how inexperienced they were. Its manual contained only one sentence about the system that was the root cause of the crashes, and worst of all, it persuaded the FAA and its airline customers that pilots didn't need the flight simulator training to fly the MAX. The release of a devastating batch of internal Boeing emails late last week showing engineers rushing to get a plane to market despite knowing it had serious problems only reinforced the notion that Boeing's culture had been compromised. A company that had long been run by engineers, A company that had long been run by engineers for engineers was now a company ran by corporate bureaucrats whose primary goal was to please Wall Street. That's the underlying story those emails tell. Which begs the question, how did this happen? In The Atlantic not long ago, business writer Jerry Useem suggests an answer. He marks May 2001 as the beginning of Boeing's cultural decline. That month, top executives announced they were moving the company's headquarters to Chicago. More than 30,000 engineers would remain in Seattle, mind you, but the company's top 500 executives would move 2,000 miles away. Quote, when the headquarters is located in proximity to a principal business, as ours was in Seattle, the corporate center is inevitably drawn into day-to-day business operations, in quote, CEO Phil Condit said at the time. How he could view removing the top brass from the, quote, day-to-day business operations as a net positive is beyond comprehension. But he did. Useem wrote, the present 737 MAX disaster can be traced back to the moment Boeing's leadership decided to divorce itself from the firm's own culture. Condit was ousted in 2003, in part because he had a series of affairs with female employees, and was succeeded by Harry Stonecipher. Stonecipher, who had been the CEO of McDonnell Douglas when it merged with Boeing in 1997, had spent the bulk of his career at General Electric, including 7 years under Jack Welch. As I've noted before, Welch's stated goal was to make GE, quote, the world's most valuable company, which meant focusing first and foremost on finding ways to increase the company's share price. As his underlings took over with other companies, they brought that mindset with them. And Stonecipher was no exception. At Boeing, he gained a reputation as a ruthless cost cutter, and he expressed pride in the way he was blowing up the company's engineering mindset. When people say I changed the culture at Boeing, that was the intent. So it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm, he once said. Wall Street loved it, and the stock price rose fourfold. When Stonecipher was fired in 2005, also for having an affair with a subordinate, the board passed over the obvious internal candidate, Alan Mulally, at the head of the Boeing's commercial airplane division, and Boeing's last great engineering executive, and brought in another Jack Welch protege, James McNerney. So now, Boeing's had a CEO who knew nothing about how to manufacture an airplane, and this lack of engineering know-how was compounded when McNerney named Scott Carson to succeed Mulally, who left in 2006 to become the CEO of Ford. True, Carson was a Boeing lifer, but he was a salesman, not an engineer. In 2007, McNerney inaugurated a series of stock buyback plans which lifted the stock price. It repurchased $6 billion worth of shares in 2014 alone. The CEO and other top executives received tens of millions of dollars worth of stock options and stock grants. Dividends were doubled, and the stock bottomed out at $30 a share in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But by the time McNerney stepped down, it was approaching $150 a share. Meanwhile, Boeing is putting the screws to its unions, eliminating their pensions and moving some production to a non-union facility in South Carolina. Richard Abalafia, the well-known aviation consultant, thinks this was a critical mistake, and another example of how little McNerney understood about the business of building airplanes. Quote, aviation's not like other industries, he wrote in Forbes after McNerney announced his retirement. There are certainly cost pressures, but this is a capital-intensive business with very high barriers to entry. Labor costs just don't matter as much compared to other industries, end quote. Abalafia concluded, quote, an experienced and motivated workforce, therefore, is the most important asset a company has. McNerney failed to recognize this important fact, and the company suffered as a result, end quote. In that same essay, Abalafia noted that the incoming CEO, Muhlenberg, was an aviation engineer, and though he'd spent his career on the defense side of the company, there was hope that he could reverse some of McNerney's emphasis on the stock price. But it wasn't to be. Instead, he ratcheted up the company's stock buybacks, retiring 200 million shares, a quarter of the company's stock, at a cost of $43 billion. How could Boeing afford to do that? As Jonathan Ford pointed out last August in the Financial Times, it was precisely because it was saving so much money on the 737 MAX. Instead of starting from scratch and building a new plane, it simply, quote, bolted new fuel-efficient engines onto a tweaked existing airframe. Ford concluded, quote, Boeing was able to redirect some of those savings to repurchase stock instead. By the time Boeing decided to cobble together the 737 MAX, its engineering culture was completely broken. Here's how Abalafia described it to Useem in The Atlantic. It was the ability to comfortably interact with an engineer who in turn feels comfortable telling you their reservations versus calling a manager more than 1,500 miles away who you know has a reputation for wanting to take your pension away. It's a very different dynamic. As a recipe for disempowering engineers in particular, you couldn't come up with a better format. And you can see that disempowerment and its consequences in the recently released emails. Instead of bringing their fears and complaints to superiors, the engineers grouse to themselves about the problems they see with the plane. They're bitter about management's unwillingness to slow things down, to build the plane properly, to take the care that's required to prevent tragedy from striking. There's one email in particular from an unidentified Boeing engineer that I can't get out of my head. It was written in June 2018, about a year after the company had begun shipping the 737 MAX to customers. It says, everyone has it in their head that meeting schedule is most important, because that's what leadership pressures and messages. All the messages are about meeting schedule, not delivering quality. We put ourselves in this position by picking the lowest cost supplier and signing up to impossible schedules. Why did the lowest ranking and most unproven supplier receive the contract? Solely based on bottom dollar. Supplier management drives all these decisions, yet we can't even keep one person doing the same job in SM for more than 6 months to a year. They don't know this business, and those that do don't have the appropriate level of input. I don't know how to fix these things. It's systemic. It's culture. It's the fact that we have a senior leadership team that understands very little about the business and yet are driving us to certain objectives. It's lots of individual groups that aren't working closely and being accountable. Sometimes you have to let things fail big so that everyone can identify a problem. And maybe that's what needs to happen instead of continuing to just scrape by. Of course, that's exactly what happened. The 737 MAX failed big, at a cost of 346 lives. Shareholder value has caused much harm in the 3 decades since it became the core value of American capitalism. Diabetics who can't afford insulin, students ripped off by for-profit universities, patients gouged by hospital change, and so much else. But none worse than this. Again, that article in Bloomberg by Joe Nocera. And if you're looking for a really interesting true crime type podcast to listen to, when you're not listening to this one, of course, Joe produced a really neat one for Wondery. It's called The Shrink Next Door, and it's for sure worth a listen. As the investigation surrounding the MAX's certification continues, some of the emails between Boeing employees that we've all heard a little bit about are coming public, and as such, some really choice quotes are surfacing. You want to hear some of them? Our next article is from DW.com, and it's called Boeing 737 MAX. Internal documents reveal staff mocking regulators and management.
Boeing internal documents released Thursday by U.S. lawmakers have revealed employees knew about problems with pilot training for the 737 MAX and tried to conceal them from federal aviation regulators. The communications also show that Boeing employees bragged that they could get the now grounded aircraft certified with minimal training for pilots by misleading U.S. regulators about some of the problems with the simulators. Quote, "This airplane's designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys," end quote, said an employee in 2017, apparently in reference to senior management and/or regulators. The documents include exchanges among Boeing test pilots that highlight problems with the simulators reproducing actual flight conditions, Boeing said. Now open to the public, the once secret documents could further derail the company's reputation and deteriorate relations with regulators as the former best-selling grounded jetliner waits to restart operations. The article discusses the history of the deadly crashes, which we've covered multiple times, so I'll skip ahead. The next section called Insider Information. The latest set of internal Boeing communications were given to the FAA and Congress in December, but were only released Thursday. Quote, "Would you put your family on a MAX simulator-trained aircraft? I wouldn't," end quote, another Boeing employee wrote to a colleague in another exchange. "No," the colleague answered. Quote, "I still haven't been forgiven by God for the covering up I did last year," one employee wrote in a message from 2018 in reference to dealing with the U.S. FAA. Quote, "I know, but this is what these regulators get when they try and get in the way. They impede progress," another wrote in August 2015. In response to the released documents, Boeing said in a statement, quote, "Some of these communications relate to the development and qualification of Boeing MAX simulators in 2017 and 2018. The company said it sent the internal documents to lawmakers for the purpose of transparency. Boeing is now working to make changes to its automated flight control system at the request of the FAA. On December 23rd, the company replaced Chief Executive Dennis Muilenburg with its chairman, David Calhoun, after the board decided a change in leadership was necessary to, quote, "repair relationships with regulators, customers, and other stakeholders," end quote, amidst the protracted 737 MAX crisis. FAA spokesperson Lynn Lunsford said the regulator found no new safety risks that have not already been uncovered as part of the FAA's demands for changes. Quote, "Any potential safety deficiencies identified in the documents have been addressed," adding that the simulator mentioned in the communications has already been checked 3 times in the last 6 months. Peter DeFazio, chairman of the House Transportation Committee, accused Boeing of putting profit over safety. Quote, "They paint a deeply disturbing picture of the lengths Boeing was apparently willing to go to in order to evade scrutiny from regulators, flight crews, and the flying public, even as its own employees were sounding alarms internally," said DeFazio, adding that the documents detail, quote, "some of the earliest and most fundamental errors in the decisions that went into the fatally flawed aircraft." The grounding of the MAX will cost Boeing billions in compensation to families of passengers killed in the crashes and airlines that canceled thousands of flights. Again, that article from DW.com. I found another article from Aerotime, and I can't help but read it because there's a Trump tweet in it, but it's more about branding. There's an attitude that maybe the whole MAX moniker is beat and just needs to go away. The article is from the 20th of January at Aerotime News Hub by Rytis Beresnevikus. He writes, Stephen Udvar-Hazy, executive chairman of the board at Air Lease Corporation, an aircraft leasing company with 15 737 MAX aircraft in its disposal and 135 more on order, bluntly told what the manufacturer should do with the MAX brand during a conference in Dublin on January 20th. Quote, "We've asked Boeing to get rid of that word MAX. I think that word MAX should go down in the history books as a bad name for an aircraft," said Hazy. Quote, "The MAX brand is damaged, and there's really no reason for it." With no end in sight to the ungrounding of the troubled Boeing jet, the situation seemingly getting worse for Boeing, as Hazy shared a sentiment that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, expressed back in April 2019. In his tweet, he wrote, "What do I know about branding? Maybe nothing, but I did become president. But if I were Boeing, I would fix the 737 MAX, add some additional great features, and rebrand the plane, all in caps, with a new name. No product has suffered like this one. But again, what the hell do I know?" Boeing's hole in the 737 MAX crisis is getting bigger. Reports on January 17, 2020 revealed that the manufacturer found a new software issue with the flight control computers aboard the narrowbody. The problem relates to monitoring functions of the jet, as one of the system monitors did not power up correctly and did not communicate with the second flight control computer, reported ABC News. Previously, in early January 2020, regulators found further issues with the aircraft's wiring systems that control the horizontal stabilizer of the jet. Potentially, the wires could short circuit, causing the pilots to lose control of the aircraft. Airlines have issued grim predictions on the return to service date of the grounded aircraft. American, Southwest, and United indicate that they expect the 737 MAX to fly commercially only in June of 2020. If the provisional schedules prove to be right, the 737 MAX would be sat on the ground for more than a year since aviation authorities around the world banned it from carrying passengers after the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crash in the early morning hours on March 10, 2019. For Boeing, meanwhile, 2019 is looking like a year that needs to be forgotten. With record low orders and deliveries numbers and a damaged brand on its poster boy aircraft, the manufacturer is looking to move on, including a change at the helm of the company. So, there we are. It'll be interesting to see if Boeing decides to change it up, won't it? You know, I say this every time, and today's no different. The reason I do these episodes is to keep you all informed about what's going on with one of the biggest cogs in our aviation machine. Not to disparage, defame, or hate on Boeing, and that's because I want them to succeed just as much as anybody else. As a leader in our industry, as a leader in American manufacturing, and as something that affects all of us in the modern world. So, let's all do our best to stay up to date. Let's stay on the right side of things and hope that with re-energized focus on engineering, Boeing will once again become the aviation powerhouse it once was. And we can all say again, once and for all, that if it ain't Boeing, we ain't going. And as we move into the future, Boeing actually has some pretty cool plans on the horizon for new products. A collaboration with Embraer on a new turboprop, and maybe even a new clean sheet airplane of their own. Check this article out. It's from Aviation Week on January 22nd, 2020, called "Boeing is, quote, excited about a possible new Embraer turboprop." From Dublin, Boeing appears to be watching a new turboprop in the planning at its likely future joint venture partner Embraer with some interest. Quote, "Boeing's familiar with the current Embraer study for development of a new turboprop," a Boeing spokesperson told Aviation Daily. Quote, "We look forward to reviewing the business case and are excited by the possibility of this new airplane being developed and produced within our planned joint venture," end quote. Embraer Commercial Aircraft President and CEO John Slattery is targeting an entry into service date of late 2025 or early 2026 for a new turboprop aircraft management's been studying for 2 years. Slattery said at the Air Finance Journal Dublin 2020 conference that the company will be in the position to present the business plan to the board at the end of 2019 for a decision to launch the aircraft, which he believes will happen on the back orders for, quote, hundreds of aircraft. Embraer has been devoting significant efforts to the project as it prepares to transition its commercial aircraft business to the Boeing Brazil commercial joint venture. Slattery pointed out that the project can only happen inside the joint venture, as Embraer alone will not be in the position to find the large investment needed on its own. In Slattery's view, a new aircraft would provide much-needed new competition in the turboprop market where ATR has, quote, an effective monopoly. Embraer and Boeing are still waiting for European Commission approval for the joint venture, but the project has received unconditional regulatory approval by 8 out of 10 competition authorities needed. The ATR comment is in line with Embraer's position that its tie-up with Boeing is good for competition as it allows the two to widen their product portfolio, much like Airbus has done through acquisition of the former Bombardier C series and its shareholding in ATR. Slattery told Aviation Daily on the sidelines of the conference that the 2025-2026 entry into service timeline is crucial for 2 main reasons. Firstly, several airlines will be on the verge of making a decision to replace aging turboprops around that time, and also, Embraer assumes that hybrid electric aircraft could be viable on regional routes around 2035, giving the manufacturer only about 10 years to recover the investment ahead of the arrival of a new competitor. The manufacturer also believes that ATR will react with a new aircraft should Embraer go ahead with the launch. Embraer is currently looking at a 2-member family of turboprops at the upper end of the market that could be complemented by a third smaller variant at a later stage that's possibly hybrid electrically powered. The aircraft, quote, will have the look and feel of an Embraer E2. Slattery is confident that the engine manufacturers will come up with power plant options that will offer major cash operating cost savings over existing engines. And again, that article from Aviation Week by Jens Flotel. And for our very last article about Boeing's future, it's from Aviation Week again, and it's called "Boeing Heads Back to the Drawing Board on a New Market Aircraft." Even as Boeing recommits itself to returning the 737 MAX to service by the middle of 2020, the company says it's going back to the drawing board of our plans to develop a new mid-market aircraft, also referred to as NMA. Boeing plans instead to refocus on a next-generation design that meets the more immediate demands of the market. The revised design will also build on lessons learned from the MAX and potentially incorporate fundamental changes into the company's traditional approach to flight control philosophy and piloting. Revealing the change in direction, recently installed Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun says, quote, "The NMA project is going to be a new clean sheet of paper," end quote. Since the program began in earnest in 2015, quote, "things have changed a bit. Not so much MAX-related, but the competitive playing field's a little different," he says. Boeing was on the cusp of seeking board authority to offer the NMA to airlines in March to April of 2019 when the plan was derailed by the second 737 MAX accident and subsequent worldwide grounding of the model. Stemming from earlier 757 replacement studies, the baseline NMA family concept was expanded to include a successor to the 767, and by early last year it was considered ready for market. The program was focused on two main versions, the 225-seat NMA-6X and the 275-seat NMA-7X, with the larger of the pair expected to be developed first. The larger NMA, believed to be dubbed internally as the 7K7-7X, was provisionally targeted at entry into service in 2025 and was expected to counter the similarly sized Airbus A321XLR. The new Airbus variant was officially approved by the European manufacturer in June 2019 and has recently gained ground in the key U.S. market where both American Airlines and United Airlines have selected the model. The latter carrier plans to take its first 321XLR in 2024 and begin transatlantic services with the longer-range variant in 2025. The overall rethink on NMA means that Boeing's product development strategy is therefore more likely to pivot back to the studies of a future small airplane, FSA, a new generation family covering the roughly 160 to 220 seat sector that targets the bulk of the 737 market. Although Boeing opted to re-engine the 737 and launch the MAX in 2011 in favor of an all-new FSA, the 4,000-plus order backlog for the MAX means production set to continue well into the decade even if Boeing experiences significant cancellations. This is likely to provide an additional buffer of time for Boeing to develop a 737 replacement family, which senior Boeing sources say could leverage the work already performed over the past 4 years on the low-cost production system concepts and advanced materials, structures, and systems developed for NMA. Much of the sourcing activity for NMA, including engine selection, was well underway earlier in 2019 when the MAX crisis took hold. Calhoun indicates that he has faith in the resilience of the MAX backlog despite the grounding and that this will give the company some breathing room for developing a successor. Quote, "I'm guessing and projecting that the MAX will hold its own and that the market split that existed prior to MCAS will restore itself and that that'll give us a lot of freedom on the next airplane. But I wouldn't kid you if there were a reason that share position didn't restore itself." The revised focus on a new aircraft family smaller than NMA will also challenge the engine makers, which up until now have been designing new power plants in the 50,000-pound thrust range. The GE Safran CFM International joint venture was competing against Pratt & Whitney to be the sole source supplier for NMA, and the change in direction may enable Rolls-Royce to re-enter the fray. Rolls dropped out of the NMA race in February 2019, citing concerns over its ability to meet Boeing's original development schedule. All three manufacturers are now expected to begin evaluating new, smaller engines. Commenting on the potential change in flight control design thinking that would come with the revised design approach, Calhoun says, quote, "I've had discussions with the FAA. We might have to start with a flight control philosophy before we actually get to the airplane, because the decision around pilots flying airplanes, that's a very important decision for a regulator and for us to get our head around," end quote. In reference to how the change may see Boeing move closer to the flight control system approach adopted by Airbus, he adds, quote, "We've always favored airplanes that required more pilot flying than maybe our competitor did, but we're all going to have to get our head around exactly what we want out of that. So that'll be a process that will go on alongside of the next airplane development," end quote. In an Airbus design, the flight control system will protect the aircraft from entering prescribed attitudes and speeds by limiting and augmenting the movement of flight control surfaces, while in a Boeing fly-by-wire design, like the 777 and 787, the pilot retains final control authority to override the limits of the flight control system. Well, I think this is all pretty exciting. Musicians and car manufacturers do collaborations all the time, so why not transport category airplanes, right? And to see a new market airplane from Boeing to replace the very, very old 737 family, that's pretty interesting. And I know we've all been thinking about it for really a long time, but to see them actually putting work on it, I think that's pretty cool. So I wish them all the best, and I can't wait to see what they come up with. And actually, you know what? Before we go, I can't resist. Let's just do one more. I'm going to do this just because it's really funny. It's not about Boeing, but it does involve a 787. The article is by Rob over at Flying, and he says, "Mexico still trying to sell the presidential Boeing. The slightly used VIP jet is now going for a bargain basement price." In this industry, an airplane with a for sale sign never seems all that odd, but when the airplane turns out to be a relatively new Boeing business jet, a 787 Dreamliner no less, people tend to pay attention. Boeing business jets are usually purchased for senior executive or VIP transportation, and with a list price north of $200 million a copy, owning a BBJ 787 isn't for everyone. There are fewer than half a dozen BBJ 787s in service, and there's an international sales deal cooking, however, to entice just the right buyer for a slightly used 787, in case one of our readers is interested. When leadership switched hands in Mexico in 2018, one of the first items on Andrés Manuel López Obrador's new agenda was to open the presidential palace to the public and get rid of the former president's personal airplane, a BBJ 787. Obrador considers it too ostentatious for the leader of a country like Mexico. A year later, Mexico still owns a 787 without a single taker, even though the value is now plummeted to about $130 million. With no takers in sight, the Mexican government has stepped up its sales efforts, which could mean a bargain 787 for some lucky buyer. They've tried personally reaching out to more than a dozen potential owners, all of whom have said no. The Mexican government even pitched the airplane to President Trump, thinking it might fit somewhere within the business empire, even suggesting a no-cash deal. Bloomberg reported Obrador's plan, saying, quote, "We give them the plane, and they can pay us in kind. We need x-rays, ambulances, tomographs, laboratories," he said. We didn't get an answer. So far, there's been no response from anyone within the Trump organization. All right, I just thought that was funny. Well, we've covered a lot of news, and it's been written in a lot of different styles from different countries at different times and for different organizations, but all by top-notch journalists. And before we go, if there's a journalist in you that's trying to get out, then make sure to join our 21st Century Aerospace Writers group on Facebook. I'm one of the admins, and along with actual world-class journalists like Rob, the group's a great place for anyone aspiring to write. And for the younger writers out there, I want to mention a really good opportunity. This coming from Airfax, the second annual Richard Collins Writing Prize for Young Pilots is out once more, and here's what it's all about. Over at Airfax Journal, editor-in-chief John Zimmerman writes, the Richard Collins family has once again partnered with Sporties to offer the Richard Collins Writing Prize for young pilots. To qualify, the writer must be a pilot, including a student pilot, who's 24 years of age or younger. The article has to be original, not previously published, and no longer than 1,500 words. The topic should be on an event that changed or shaped the author's flying. The winning article will be published in Airfax, the publication Richard's father, Leighton, founded in 1938, and which was relaunched 8 years ago by Sporties as an online magazine. The articles will be judged by a panel of three: Richard Collins Jr., J. Mac McClellan, and Amy Laboda. Quote, Richard Collins left a rich legacy in aviation, including the many young writers he encouraged or hired, says Sporties Vice President and Airfax editor John Zimmerman. Quote, the prize is a great way to continue that important work and to honor a great writer. The winning article will be published in Airfax, while its writer will receive a check for $2,500. The prize will be announced during the 2020 Sun and Fun Fly-In in Lakeland, Florida. Articles can be submitted now through March 3rd and sent as a Word document to editor@airfaxjournal.com. In addition, young pilots are required to submit a 100-word bio to accompany their articles. There's going to be a link to the article in the show notes, and while you're there, you can read last year's winning piece by Emma Hutchinson. All right, so we've covered a lot today, and I'm sure at least something struck a chord with you in there somewhere. So let me know your thoughts. Send me an email, brandon@podcastingonaplane.com, or you can record something. You can use your smartphone or use the SpeakPipe widget that pops up each time you visit podcastingonaplane.com. And while you're there, maybe consider supporting the show. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. Or if you're not into the recurring thing, maybe head over to buymeacoffee.com/BravoGolf, spelled out, and do the one-time thing in increments of just $3. And as always, I thank you so much for your support and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your other favorite aviation podcasts. Next time, we'll be back to storytelling, but for today, that's all. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
I'm Chris Dunn from theflyingweatherman.com. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brendan's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI. Nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.